This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. 50 years ago this week, Canada officially made beavers one of our national symbols. In celebrating this anniversary and the many ecological services and benefits provided by beavers, the Fur Bearers have a bit of beaver fever. And who better to talk about beavers than Ben Goldfarb, the journalist behind Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. This book has made big waves since it landed in 2018, and today, Ben joins Defender Radio to share how he started out writing Eager, what he loves about beavers, his newer works, and how we can look to beavers for hope in uncertain times. But I think to get started, before we get to beavers, what would be really interesting is to learn a bit about how you got into journalism and specifically conservation journalism. Where did that journey start for you?
Well, let's see. As an undergraduate in college, I studied creative writing and environmental science. So I always had those two interests. And then after college, I had a series of kind of field ecology tech jobs working for the National Park Service in Yellowstone and the New York City Parks Department, and tagging sea turtles in North Carolina, doing all this cool ecology work. But, along the way, I was also keeping blogs and writing about the experiences I was having. And eventually I realized that I loved the writing about nature and wildlife more than anything else. And that became the full-time gig.
That's really awesome. And it's so great that you were able to do that. What were some of the early things you covered? Was it a very easy transition for you to go, oh, this was a cool thing I did while out working with turtles in North Carolina article, or was it something where it opened your eyes to a world and you had to start exploring subjects in a new way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from the get-go, I was covering wildlife, ecology, conservation, the same stuff I'm writing about now. I was always fascinated by habitat connectivity, the idea that animals need these large, intact landscapes through which to wander. So one of my really formative journalistic experiences, right when I decided to take the leap and write full time, was I got a grant to travel the entirety of the Yellowstone to Yukon wildlife corridor, starting from the Yukon and going south to Yellowstone National Park. So my then girlfriend, now wife, and I made that trip over a couple of months, and I was interviewing sources along the way, and of course, seeing lots of incredible wildlife, and that experience, the opportunity to drive through and hike through some of the kind of the wildest, most intact ecosystems in North America. That was a really profound, formative experience that really still influences what I cover today.
I imagine so. That's it's an incredible conservation program, the Y2K, which is funny to say now. It's not Y2K. It's Yukon to Yellowstone. Y to Y. Y2K was something else. Yeah.
Yeah. A little anticlimactic.
Yeah. I do remember that night very clearly and thinking, now it's over. And then here we are sometime later. Anyway, and I guess that's when things started to open up for you. You were being published in great magazines. I mean, Smithsonian Magazine to me would be the pinnacle of it all. But getting out there and writing about these things, and then comes Eager. This is a book that put you on a lot of people's radars, really moved you up, I think, in the echelon of writing and publications.
Oh, geez.
Well, it's a great book that it's very much opened a lot of people's eyes to a very important subject. And it's a good read. I think that's the other thing people really loved about it, is it's not just an informative book. It's good, it's fun to read, and it's one you can pick up, put down, and just always feel like you're walking away with something, which is an awesome kind of book, in my opinion. But could we talk a bit about how you got there? Again, is this part of the journey from Yukon to Yellowstone? Was this something you had seen along the way, learning about beavers? Or was it something that you chose to look at very specifically?
Yeah, well, and thanks for saying all that nice stuff about Eager, Mike. I really appreciate it, especially coming from somebody as beaver knowledgeable as you. I think, for me, look, I always loved beavers. I mean, as a kid, I grew up in New York and spent a lot of time hiking and camping and fishing in the Catskills, the Adirondacks. Some of the more beavery places in the northeastern U.S. I have this early childhood memory of being on a lake in the Adirondacks with my parents after dark, and hearing the classic gunshot of the tail slap next to the canoe, and practically capsizing the canoe. We were so startled. I always liked beavers and cared about them. But the true kind of conversion story, for me that happened, maybe a year or so after that Wide Hawaii trip. I was again early in my career as a journalist. I was working at the time for a magazine called High Country News, which covers environmental issues throughout the American West. I was living in Seattle, and somebody sent me this flyer for a beaver workshop that was happening just outside the city. And I had no idea what a beaver workshop was or what that entailed. But you're a journalist, right? You sort of have this instinct for what might be a story. It sounded like it could be a cool story. So I went to this beaver workshop, and it was just one scientist after another getting up to say their piece about why beavers were so important for all of the reasons that listeners of this podcast understand. Their water storage abilities and their salmon habitat creation and wildfire mitigation and water quality, and you run down the list. And for me, that was just this incredibly eye-opening experience where I realized that, hey, this animal that I had grown up liking and caring about wasn't just, a cool, fun, interesting rodent. It was really one of the primary architects of the North American landscape, and also one of the most important ecological tools in our toolbox, not to reduce, a wild animal with agency to a tool, but
Yeah.
they're valuable partners in restoration, as we all know. And so it was that workshop that just totally radicalized me, and so I ended up writing a few articles that came out of that workshop. I spent a lot of time with some of the beaver restoration folks working in Washington State, like the Methow Valley Beaver Project up in Winthrop, Washington. Got to see some beavers being relocated. That was a great experience. And so and then over the next few years, those articles basically turned into Eager, the book.
It's always interesting how those stories come together to me, because I talk with some people where it's I decided I wanted to write this book, and then I just threw myself into research.
Yeah.
But I find a lot of the time with nature journalism or naturalist writing, it is very much I'd already written half the book when I decided to write the book effectively, which is
Right.
kind of the impression I'm getting from you of there was a lot of stuff already. You'd gained a lot of knowledge. You'd already done a lot of interviews and learned a lot. And then it was sort of putting it together, I guess, more than actually deciding to do it to get from zero to finished.
Yeah, I think that's right, and also just figuring out the different geographies in which people were working on beavers. I mean, I think that's
Mhm.
one of the incredible things about these animals, right? Is that they're doing basically the same thing everywhere you find them, right? They're of course building dams and creating ponds and wetlands, but how those ponds and wetlands affect the landscape and why we care about those ponds and wetlands is different depending on what geography you're in, right? So in Washington, where I was living when I started this process, salmon was kind of the primary motivator
Yeah.
for people caring about beavers, because of course beavers create incredible salmon habitat. In this kind of the arid intermountain West, it was drought mitigation and water storage. I went to England and Scotland, where people cared primarily about flood control. These rainy places that are getting wetter with climate change. In Nevada, it's sage grouse. In North Carolina, it's rare butterflies that beaver wetlands are supporting. Right. So that was, to me, when I said, okay, I'm going to go from writing these articles about beavers in the state of Washington and salmon habitat to, okay, now I'm going to write an entire book about beavers. That was sort of the first step for me, was figuring out the different geographies in which people were working on these animals, and why they're so important wherever you are, and how those kind of regional values and ecological connections differ.
The regional values is a fascinating subject too that I've read a bit about in the horticulture world, where I'm doing some classwork, and how depending on where you are, cultural expectations, even within a single city, can change from one side of the city to the other.
Right.
And it's interesting to apply that to something like people's perception of beavers. that it would have such regional cultural differences in that way. Was that something that was surprising to you to really encounter and see? Like, it's the same animal, the biology is the same. These, as again, they are very individual critters, but beavers are not that different, I guess, across the North American landscape. But you have all of these different attitudes. Did that come as a surprise to you?
Yeah, it did, and I think that what was interesting was writing about beavers in a United States context in which people aren't
Mhm.
as beaver savvy as I think your Canadian peers are, right? I mean, I know that you've had Francis Backhouse on the podcast, and
Yep.
Michael Rentz, and I mean, when I conceptualized Eager, there were some great books out there about beavers already, right? But they were kind of Canadian books, and
Yeah.
obviously the U.S. certainly appears in Once They Were Hats, but it is a kind of a Canada-centric book, and I think that reflects the kind of the differential understanding of how important these animals are in our two countries, right? I mean, I think that in Canada, of course, beavers are on your currency, right? There's so much.
Yep.
They're this kind of national mammal. There's so much iconography around beavers, whereas in the U.S., I think there's a lot of comparative beaver ignorance. I don't think people recognize
Mhm.
these animals as being historically incredibly abundant, but there were so many amazingly iconic American beaver stories. The story of the American Revolution, is partly the story of the fur trade, because, one of the British offenses that angered the colonists was denying them access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachians, right? I mean,
Mhm.
Lewis and Clark described seeing beavers in every tributary going up the Missouri River during the Corps of Discovery. The Louisiana Purchase, right? I mean, that was, Jefferson partly trying to secure new areas to trap beavers, right? So, I think there's this understanding. There's that the great Margaret Atwood quote, which I'm paraphrasing, that that Canada was built on the backs of dead beavers or something like that. But
Yeah.
you could say the same thing about the United States, right? And I think that that most Americans don't realize that the way that Canadians realize it. And so I think that that was one of the things I was trying to do as well, was say, okay, we know, thanks to Francis and Michael and others, that that beavers are this iconic Canadian animal. What's their role in American landscapes as well? It's not like beavers stop at the border.
Yeah. Well, these days they might. But we won't
That's
get
right.
into the
Yeah.
politics of it.
Yeah.
Um,
That no,
so I
definitely
am
not.
curious. This came out in 2018. Eager, Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, and we're now 2025. From your perspective, from when the book came out and first started hitting stores and you first started seeing reviews to today, would you say there is a better or changing understanding of beavers in American culture, or even in some of the more particular or the more specific areas, like in municipal planning and roads and works? And we'll get into your next book as well, talking about roads and works. Have you seen a shift over those several years?
Yeah, I mean there's been a dramatic tectonic shift, in American attitudes towards beavers. And I think that Eager probably added a stick to the dam, but I mean, there's just so many different organizations and people and groups working on beavers over the last decade that have helped to move the ball. I mean, I think about the I mean, look, one of the great examples of that is California, right? Which is sort of
Yeah.
I think the best example of beaver progress in the country, probably. When I wrote Eager, the chapter about California was how backwards California was, right? I mean, California was this state that actually didn't even acknowledge until very recently that beavers were native to most of the state. They basically
Mhm.
managed them as a non-native species, which is completely backwards, as many fantastic scientists and advocates proved by reviewing the historical evidence. But again, the chapter in Eager about California is basically here's this state that needs beavers more than any place in the country probably, and treats them as hostile,
Yep.
because they have this historical misconception about where beavers belong. Fast forward to 2025, California is one of the most pro beaver places on earth. There's the state has a fantastic beaver program, and Gavin Newsom is a beaver fan, and this, they did their first relocation a couple of years ago, and that's a testament to the hard work of lots of people. The Bring Back the Beaver campaign out of the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center with Kate Lundquist and Brock Dolman, who are just incredible beaver champions. Of course, Heidi Perryman, a famous person in the beaver
Mm-hmm.
world from Martinez, California, who advocated for these animals. So there's just this incredible groundswell of beaver support that has just completely changed the story for these critters. I think about the Beaver Believers, the fantastic documentary by Sarah
Yep.
Koenigsberg, all the work that Emily Fairfax has done on the beaver wildfire connection. I think, maybe more than any other sort of beaver connection. I mean, it's Emily's firework that's
Yep.
that's kind of gotten attention and moved beavers forward, because of course fire is an issue on the top of everyone's mind in
Mm-hmm.
the American West. So yeah, I think the outlook for beavers has definitely changed, and that's that's all of course incredibly exciting.
It is. It's great to see the evolution of it happening, and I think relatively quickly, all things considered, these days.
Oh, it's dramatic. Yeah, it's incredible how rapid it is.
Yeah, I think it's as soon as people kind of realize, oh, not only do beavers just do this work that makes the landscape better in most ways,
Yeah.
but we don't have to do anything about it. I think that's the big thing that I hear people sort of surprised about is, oh, well, we have to bring a beaver here and put it there. They have to be, and like we have to manage them very particularly. And when they realize it's kind of a no, the beavers are going to go where there's not enough water, but a little bit of water, do their thing, and then you have water.
Right.
And if there are infrastructure challenges, there are non-lethal, humane solutions that allow the beavers generally to remain in place while protecting the infrastructure. And they go, oh, why aren't we doing that? And I think that's kind of the question of the day at times is, well, why aren't we just letting beavers back onto the landscape and allowing them to do their thing? I try and at times across Canada, wherever I am, try and envision the area as it was several hundred years ago before we
Yeah.
nearly wiped out beavers and recognize like this Walmart's was probably home to 20 beavers and this thriving ecosystem that they didn't control, that they generated and maintained, and all of the different species of flora and fauna that are interdependent upon this beaver pond being here. Um, and it's at one hand overwhelming and another hand really exciting. Um, do you think there is still resistance because it is a historic idea, the idea that beavers did have a lot of dominion over North America's landscape? Then we effectively killed most of them off. And now the numbers are, I mean, the numbers have recovered to a point that we don't need to worry about beavers, but it's still nowhere near where it was. I think it was something insane, like 300 or 30 million beavers, something like that.
Oh, I
Um,
think
was it
an
300?
order of magnitude more than that. Yeah, I think hundreds of
Yeah.
millions of beavers is a pretty safe assumption.
Yeah, so it's been a seismic shift. It's not back, and it probably will never be back to where it was. But
Right.
do you think that historic mindset of, oh, well, they're a problem that we have to deal with, is a significant issue in terms of moving people forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two issues that go hand in hand with that. I mean, first is what you're alluding to, which is just we don't really understand how profoundly abundant these animals were, right? I mean, when we trapped out several hundred million beavers, we changed landscapes in ways that we
Mhm.
don't totally recognize, right? I mean, I read about this in Eager. Of course, Francis writes about this in Once They Were Hats. The idea that you took all of these incredible beaver pond and wetland complexes, killed the animals. The dams broke down, and those wetlands dried up, and the streams degraded into single thread channels, and so you go from this incredibly lush blue green wet beaver filled valley bottom to a narrow meandering stream moving through a dry valley, and
Yep.
I think the issue is that we don't realize when we look at that meandering single thread stream through a dry valley, we don't necessarily recognize that that's wrong, right?
Mhm.
Because we all grew up. I mean, I love to fly fish, and I fly fish in those sorts of places, right? You can catch plenty of trout, in a meandering single thread channel, and so it feels healthy. But then you think about what the historical baselines were, and you look at systems in which beavers have recovered, and you realize, oh yeah, there should be ponds and wetlands all over this valley bottom. It shouldn't just be a single narrow threaded channel. it should be this incredible wetland complex. And so, in some ways, I think if we're going to embrace beavers, we have to reconfigure our historical imaginations and think differently about what our ecosystems and landscapes are supposed to look like. So I think that's one challenge. And then the other challenge that you alluded to is the coexistence challenge, right? The fact that beavers and humans are both fanatical micromanagers of the natural world, right? We both love, arranging the landscape to maximize our food and shelter. The problem is that we do it in very different ways, right? We like everything neat and tidy. We like our roads and our railroads and our irrigation ditches. We like linear infrastructure, right? Whereas beavers create what looks to us like a mess. There are ponds and dams and wetlands everywhere, and they're dead and dying trees all over the place, and little sharpened sticks poking out of the ground, and the bottom of the pond is all sediment and mucky, so we just have this kind of divergent vision with them about how these systems should work. And of course, we modify systems, what aquatic systems, in ways that are fundamentally negative to the vast majority of biological life, and beavers do it in a way that's positive to the vast majority of biological life. So we need to, I do think that there's this humility that we need to adopt, and to recognize that, hey, if we're going to solve a lot of our ecological challenges, we need to turn over the management of our landscapes to these rodents who were here longer and do it better than we do.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great tie-in to talking about road ecology and your more recent book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. This is a subject I personally have found so interesting to read about and experience. I was very fortunate to interview some folks out of Parks Canada
Oh,
in
cool.
Banff, where they've actually done the long-term monitoring of
Oh,
wildlife
amazing.
crossings and stuff.
Cool.
And they love that work, obviously, and it's
Yeah.
saving lives and saving millions of dollars in insurance premiums.
Right.
But I thought briefly, could you share a bit about sort of the idea of road ecology, wildlife, and why it's something we need to be talking about these days?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, so road ecology is basically this relatively small but fast growing field of science that looks at all of the different connections between our transportation infrastructure and the natural world, right? And it really starts with roadkill. We've all seen the dead deer, elk by the side of the highway, and certainly a lot of road ecology is about how to prevent roadkill through the use of fences and wildlife crossings, like they did in Banff. And a lot of the book is about the design of those wildlife crossings. Where do you put them? What species do they work for? Or how do you optimize them for different species? How do we know they work? And they certainly do work really well. But road ecology is it is this kind of larger field, and so there's it's not just the wildlife crossings and fences. Also in the book I write about road noise and its impacts on songbird migrations and human health. Road salt is this tremendous polluter of aquatic
Mhm.
ecosystems that we put down tens of millions of pounds of it every year as a de-icing agent without much understanding of how dramatically it's changing our aquatic systems. You've got the impacts of roads on human societies. The fact that urban freeways in the U.S. and in Canada are sort of barriers to the movement of humans on foot, and create these really segregated cities in many places. So road ecology is again, it's this field of science that looks at all of those different relationships and connections and figures out what to do about them, how to solve some of the problems that roads create for nature.
And did you come across any particularly unique or exciting solutions? Because again, I think it's very easy for all of us to point out the problems around us. It's a skill that as humans we are very well versed in, but finding answers, celebrating them, and then trying, experimenting with them is something we need to maybe focus on more. So, were there any that stood out to you in that process of writing Crossings, or that you've learned about since writing it that are of particular excitement to you?
Yeah, I really love the chapter of the book about a really famous wildlife crossing that's under construction right now for mountain lions just outside of Los Angeles. This is the,
Mhm.
the Liberty Canyon Wildlife Crossing, or the Wallace Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. And this is built for this little population of mountain lions who live just outside of LA, some of the most urban large carnivores on Earth. And these are kind of the poster animals for the impacts of highways on wildlife. These mountain lions are basically trapped in this little island of habitat in the Santa Monica Mountains, surrounded by this ocean of freeways and development. And because these mountain lions can't cross the big busy freeways, they can't mingle and mate with mountain lions elsewhere in California. They're stuck on their little island, and as a result, they've been forced to reproduce with their own relatives, and they've become very very inbred over time. They're suffering genetic defects, and we're at risk of losing these animals if nothing is done for them. But fortunately, something is being done for them. This gigantic wildlife crossing is under construction right now. It should be done sometime, hopefully in early 2026 is the last that I heard. It's basically this huge bridge that's going to cross or is crossing the 101 freeway, the busiest freeway on Earth, 10 lanes of traffic, hundreds of thousands of cars per day. And it'll let mountain lions, as well as bobcats and deer and all kinds of other critters, go back and forth and reproduce, and hopefully heal some of those genetic divides, that fragmentation that the freeway has imposed. And I just think that's such a cool project, because it's really changing the what's possible for wildlife crossings. I mean, if you can build a wildlife crossing, close to Los Angeles over the busiest freeway on Earth, you can build one anywhere. I mean, I was a couple of years ago, I was here in Colorado. I was out with some biologists who've been trying to get a wildlife crossing built over Interstate 70, the big 4-lane freeway that that runs through Colorado and cuts off elk and lynx migrations, among other animals. And they said, look, I mean, historically, it seemed impossible that we could build a wildlife crossing over I-70. But now, hey, they're doing it in LA. We can do it here, right? So that expanding the sense of possibility and the scope of places that are appropriate for this this wildlife friendly infrastructure. I just find that so inspiring.
That's very cool. I'd like to talk a little bit about environmental journalism or conservation journalism. I get asked a lot about journalism, wildlife, and so on. I've done webinars on media sensationalism specific to coyotes and a lot of subject matter like that. And people say, well, why aren't we getting good journalism anymore about wildlife? And I mean, the quick answer is because we're firing all the journalists
And the editors.
Yeah, that too. Yes, it's very simple. That is why. But I think it also leads to the bigger question of, why is it so important to have science-educated journalists, or journalists who are capable of writing accessibly about science in today's world? I'm curious for your thoughts on that. The importance of natural journalism, conservation journalism, science communication, and so on.
Yeah, wow, that's such a great question, Mike. And it's it's so the importance of science journalism and environmental journalism. It's so fundamental to who I am and the work I do. It's almost hard to know where to begin answering that question, because I do, of course, I believe so passionately in the importance of conservation and of biodiversity, and look, I mean, conservation problems are fundamentally public facing problems, right? I mean, you know this from your work on coyotes, that that if we're going to the coyotes and beavers and ravens and prairie dogs, I mean, there's so many species that are basically animals that we have historically wiped out, in large part because we are hostile to them. And that's because we don't really understand them very well, and I certainly believe that, understanding these animals is sort of fundamental to stewarding them properly. I mean, I think about coyotes, and I've written a lot about coyotes and coyote management. An animal that's very similar to beavers, and in how we perceive it, I think, and in how many we kill, unfortunately. And I mean, there's an animal that we know is so sort of fundamental to regulating ecosystems. It's a top predator in many urban systems in North America. It's profoundly important. Lots of great research about coyotes controlling feral cats, and therefore improving songbird populations, through trophic cascades. And so, but that's another animal that we vilify because we don't fully recognize its importance. In my own experience, some of the most gratifying moments of my life have been hearing from state wildlife departments in the US saying, hey, we read your book, and we're changing our beaver management policies. Or I've had ranchers come up to me after talks and say, hey, I read your book, I stopped killing the beavers in my irrigation ditches, I bought copies for my buddies, they stopped killing their beavers. Like, wow, what a cool moment. So at the core of my being, I believe that environmental journalism can change people's minds, and through changing minds, ultimately change policy and management.
Amazing. And that actually ties into sort of where I'd like to wrap up, because we're in an era right now with a lot of uncertainty. Environmental issues that were forefront in media coverage, in elections just several years ago, are now background noise at times. And I'm wondering if you have a way where you find hope for moving forward, if there is something you look to when it's, you make the mistake of putting on television news at 11 o'clock and just go, oh, is there something for you that helps you stay the course and continue pushing forward in this important work?
Yeah, boy, that's a really good question, Mike. I mean, it is hard to feel hopeful at times, especially right now. You think about, of course, the Trump administration's dismantling of every important land management and wildlife agency in the U.S. and the consequences that's going to have for conservation. It's catastrophic, and it's hard to remain hopeful when you feel like some vandals are basically dismantling everything that you care about and love. But I do think that one of the reasons that beavers are a hopeful subject is that they're animals that can thrive without a lot of federal involvement, right? And by that I mean that the units of government that control the fate of beavers tend to be pretty local ones, right? I mean, I think about our community here in Colorado. Historically, our county road and bridge department had an informal beaver bounty. They'd kill the beavers that that they found in culverts on county roads. And that bounty no longer exists. And we're talking about how to move to the kind of non-lethal culvert protection work that the Beaver Institute does, and I'm sure you and Adam Burnett talked about.
Yep.
It's town councils, it's county road crews, it's of course individual landowners, farmers and ranchers, right? I mean, if we can influence those people and those local levels of government, then beavers are going to be okay, right? I mean, yes, there's a federal role to play, and it's sad to watch land management agencies like the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, dismantle their restoration programs. That's certainly not good for beavers. But ultimately, these are animals that we can just convince local governments to stop killing them. We can really do a lot of good and make a lot of progress. And we can do that, whether the Trump administration is burning everything to the ground or not. And so, that notion of beavers is this hyper local issue that we can influence no matter who the president is. I find hope in that.
Awesome. And then to totally wrap up, last question. I think it's, we talked a bit about journalism. We talked a bit about the conservation journalism and how you got into it. What advice do you have for others who are interested in doing what you do, or want to get into the process of trying to write or trying to be a conservation reporter, or again, even just a journaler as opposed to a journalist? Do you have tips that you would offer people to help them maybe get going in writing about local things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, look, this is in kind of facile, obvious advice, but before you can be a writer, you have to be a prolific reader. And I mean, my book certainly would not exist without the books of David Quammen and Elizabeth Colbert and John McPhee. I mean, all of the writers who I so admire and consciously and unconsciously emulate in my style. And of course, all of the magazine work that I've read over the years, and National Geographic and Harper's and the New Yorker, name every great magazine in North America. I think that's really where you begin, right? Is by reading prolifically. And, one great piece of advice that I got very early in my career from a really terrific environmental journalist named Jonathan Thompson was that, every time you read a story and are left with a question, the answer to that question is itself potentially a story, right? And I think that's especially true when you think about, sort of the local journalism. You could maybe you read a big new Environmental Protection Agency report about water quality in the US or whatever the equivalent of that is in Canada, and the question you're left with is okay, how does that, what does that say about my community?
Yep.
How can I figure out what the local implications are there? So yeah, if you read a story, you're left with the question. Answering that question, that's a story, and I think that's guided a lot of my journalism. I mean, here's one example of that. Just because we're talking about animals that are perceived as nuisance animals. I remember early in my career, I read this very short item in some newspaper in Nevada about how a county commission had just declared ravens an official nuisance species in the county, and I was like, why would ravens be a nuisance, and what does that mean, and what are the implications there? And and answering that question ended up being this very long feature about raven intelligence and how they've flourished because of anthropogenic subsidies, and and what it means to manage them properly, and so on. And it just took me down this really wonderful rabbit hole. So, read a story, answer the questions you're left with, and, you'll find plenty of stories that way.
I want to thank Ben for joining me on such short notice to get this episode out during our Beaver Week celebrations. You can learn more about Ben, his books Eager and Crossings, and more of his writings on his website at bengoldfarb.com. You can also find links in this week's show notes. Eager and Crossings are available in your local bookstore or library or via bengoldfarb.com. I also want to thank you for joining us today and choosing to celebrate Castor canadensis along with us at the Fur Bearers. Remember to hit subscribe or follow wherever you listen to Defender Radio to get notified of new episodes as they drop. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.